I was disillusioned by the education system as a boy, and I felt like my greatest strengths were treated as behavioral issues. And at about the age of 14, I found myself inside of 3 different schools within 9 months. I ended up dropping out of high school at around 16.
Unless we radically reform the school system of the United States, radically reform, unless we somehow prepare them for citizenship because they're not prepared now, the future of this country, both politically and economically, is seriously in question.
We now live in a new world and require a new paradigm of education. So I've taken my education into my own hands, and I'm traveling the world seeking out my own mentors, teachers, and experiences to build my own self-directed, self-determined education. Follow me as I seek an education in the world. So this morning we're gonna catch up and have a conversation with a good friend and mentor of mine, Ben Slater. Ben has been my mentor since the age of 17 in marketing, business, and life. And I truly believe like he is, got one of the biggest breadths and depths of knowledge, across business, spirituality, and he's played a huge role in my journey. He really showed me the path of the digital nomad and of geographical freedom, financial freedom, and he has a lot of credibility. He was a millionaire by the age of 30, built multiple 7-figure online businesses, and has traveled vastly. I feel like I have a lot to learn from him, his experience. And the crazy thing about this is I've actually never got to meet Ben in person. So this is my first time getting to meet Ben in person after years of catching up on Zoom and him mentoring me. So yeah, it's really special. What was the story of your early life, your early education?
Yeah, so I went to quite a small school on the outskirts of Sydney and wasn't the right spot. So when I was in year 10, about 16 years old, I actually moved from that school to a much bigger school. And right when that happened, we had financial issues in the family. So yeah, of course. It was weird for me because I had this thing on the outside that was just so like expansive and parties and girls and all these new friends and just so much stimulus. But on the inside, there was all this trauma happening like in the family, and I couldn't really share it with people. It was super embarrassing. And yeah, so right around that time, I started to take a lot of drugs. And I started to take a lot of drugs because I wasn't at the level emotionally to be able to deal with that sort of paradox. I actually bought Bitcoin in 2009, very, very early, which still blows my mind to this day. And yes, I do have a bunch of Bitcoins sitting in the dark web somewhere that I have lost forever. It's likely worth a lot of money. Wow. I used that to fund this habit of drugs. 4 years after that moment, I started to have psychotic splits. So just ruthless hallucinations and events that were probably the most formative events of my life, I'd say. Yeah, you'd imagine, we're walking along here, we're on this beautiful walk right now, and you'd just I'd see buildings just crumble. I was on hundreds of milligrams of these antipsychotics. And if I would take them, I would literally fall asleep within half an hour. And again, that was another thing that I just couldn't resonate with. So I started to look for alternate ways of healing myself. And yeah, I started to read and I started to train. I just started to take responsibility for my own healing.
Yeah, so what did your journey of like educating yourself look like? Look like getting mentors, reading, or what did that journey look like?
Interestingly, there's a great saying, when the student is ready, the mentor will appear. And right at that moment when I was trying to seek help, this amazing mentor stepped into my life. So he was actually mentoring my brother at the time. He was the biggest impact on me, for sure. So I was studying university at the time. I was in a finance degree. And I remember Lachlan asked me, Ben, do you see yourself in finance in 5 years? I just like felt it and I was like, nah, I don't think so. Like it doesn't feel good. And he just was like, well, why are you doing it? And I just couldn't come up with a good answer. I had one subject left to go and I went in there and I'm like, yeah, I quit. That was one of the more powerful decisions in my life, I think. But for me, it wasn't about the degree or no degree. It was about not having the capacity to fail, because I didn't want this safety net. I didn't want a certificate from some authority saying that, you know, I didn't want it, because I knew I wanted to just trail my own path. So I just burnt the boats. And funnily enough, a few months later, I was running my own business and was making just as much money as I would have 10 years later. Lachlan talked to me about this concept of universal laws. And he said that, Ben, there are universal laws in life, and you can either be in harmony with them or you can be out of harmony with them. He said, Ben, imagine that we're sitting on a beach right now and there's big waves like coming crashing in. And you know, you and I were going to sit here and we're going to watch these waves. And he asked me, okay, let's imagine that that this is an analogy for your life. He's like, what are those waves doing to you right now? And I was like, well, and I just picture myself, I'm like, well, I'm getting smashed up against the rocks, you know, like I'm getting, you know, like I'm suffering essentially. And he said, okay, well, what if there's another solution? What if you and I were to sit here, study the waves, how they're coming in, you know, the patterns, what's going on, and you and I, we're gonna grab a surfboard, and if you come on this path with me, I'm gonna teach you these principles, I'm gonna teach you how this is all working. Eventually you and I, we're gonna go out there and we're gonna have the time of our life. And that to me was like, that's kind of like what I'm aspiring to, if that makes sense. Like, I wanna know how to be in harmony with it all. And that's like what my goal of my life is, I would say. So, yeah, and Lachlan like unlocked that for me. Like just through his presence and like, yeah, so the thing that I'm most interested in is this concept of the waves are coming in, you know, like the weather patterns, they're happening. Like there's these things that we can't necessarily control in life, but we can understand them and harmonize with them. And I think when that happens, I get in flow, rhythm, harmony, like everything that's like really powerful, like inspiration, gratitude, it all comes from that. So when I talk about testing, essentially what I'm trying to do is like figure out what those principles are and then align with them. So yeah, you can see it makes me like super emotional because it's like, it's very powerful for me. Because that's essentially what saved my life. That one thing of like, okay, Ben, you're perceiving chaos, but there's order here. And once I figured that out, like everything that Lachlan told me actually turned out to be true. I was able to freely run businesses. I was able to freely travel. I was able to be completely time-free. I was able to become a millionaire before 30. I was able to be, do, and have the things that I wanted in my life. And I came from the fucking bottom of the bottom of the bottom of the barrel. And it was that one thing, that one idea. And I just took that through and just rolled with it, you know? Let's go up this way actually. We can cut around, yeah.
This is so insanely beautiful, eh?
Yeah, this is why I would love reading, just like over here, like it's sitting there. And then it goes to the Louvre just here and like just cuts all around.
Why do you think that's so powerful to go to like that idea of going to the most traumatic, painful experience, perception, and like balancing it and looking at the benefits of how it serves you? Why do you think that's so powerful?
I think every person's purpose in life is it will be in opposition to pain and their deepest, darkest pain. So I've got a couple of big voids. One of my biggest ones is around the psychosis stuff. So I felt like I'd lost my mind. I felt like I didn't exist. Felt like I was stupid, like all of these things, I can just list them out. But the big thing is like, I just felt like I was dumb. So like I led myself into this horrific experience. So really my highest value today is actually about doing the opposite. You know, it's about trying to learn and develop myself so much. And really, if you look at the deep driver of it, the deep driver of it is so that I can't experience that again. So I'm actually like pushing away from that. And that's actually where all my genius exists. That's where all my and then you can sort of go into it in different levels and stuff. But I think everyone has that.
Yeah, I think that was some of the most interesting ideas that you introduced me to, was like Joseph Campbell's stuff on the hero's journey. Like that was revelation to me. Like do you want to talk about that a little bit, about like the power of like the hero's journey and us going on the looking for the individual hero, the inner hero, rather than like a collective hero.
So Joseph Campbell was a mythologist, and he studied myths from all around the world, like every single culture. And essentially what he found was what he called the mono-myth, was that in the Inuits, you know, like in Australia, in European cultures, ancient European cultures, ancient Incans, Mayans, like everywhere from around the world, he found that their key mythology was actually sharing the mono-myth, was that it had the same archetypical structure. And so he wrote this book about the structure. George Lucas was writing the script for Star Wars. He read the book, changed the script, sent it to Joseph Campbell, said, "What do you think?" And he said, "I like what you've done. I think you're on the money here." Now, same thing has happened with Game of Thrones. Same thing has happened with Harry Potter. Same thing has happened with Lord of the Rings. The biggest story structures that we know of and are the most valuable franchises. Star Wars got sold for $4 billion. Like all of these things, they're using the same arc. So that's what's happening in culture. Now, even more interestingly than that, what I discovered through studying it was that my own life actually mapped those structures, like went through them, went through the same thing. Yeah. So there's this relationship that we have between culture and film and story and our own life. And the reason I think why we love them and why we want to go and experience them is because these stories are mapping our own spiritual journey, and we see ourselves inside of them. Most people unconsciously, but you can do it consciously. Yes, yes. There's this ancient saying, is like, the cave that you fear to enter holds the gold you seek. That you fear to enter holds the gold that you seek. Entering really deeply into that is, in most cases, the most powerful thing that people can do for their business. So yeah, the hero's journey was a really powerful thing for me, because it was, again, it was another example of this feeling of like, oh wow, I've been supported the whole time. In the background. It's beautiful. It's like, it's really, like if you can touch it and go like, oh wow. So like, I'm in some sort of growth mechanism with the universe. And these things are coming into my life at the right time with exactly what I need to help me go to the next level. And that's fucking beautiful. Like that's like, to me, just amazing, you know?
Yeah, I had a moment when I was in Copenhagen in the winter, riding my bike to like a coffee shop early in the morning, and I was listening to the doctor, and he says this line, he says, there was never anyone to forgive, there was never anyone to blame, it was perfection all along, you just couldn't see it. And I just started fucking crying on this bike ride, and I just like had this synthesized moment when I saw the perfection. And like obviously you have those I see you have those moments quite often, because you're able to, when you see the perfection, it's impossible not to just like, yeah, so you've got a high value on and super inspired by education.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on maybe the state of education, the role of education, and just, yeah, on education in general?
Yeah, so I feel like a lot of the theme of this conversation has been about the power of simplicity and the power of generalization. So, and that's the opposite of what the education system is based on. It's actually about specialization. So I would say, like, if you look at ideas, there's four phases of matter, there's four phases of ideas. There are, at the top level, the plasma level, there are universal laws that are applying to all domains, to all things. So we've talked about a few of them, like we've talked about the hero's journey. I would say that's a universal law, or at least pretty close to a universal law. We've talked about this idea of void and values, that there's a polarity, and the polarity, that's universal law. Those things for me, when I uncover one of those and integrate it into my life, is worth the weight of gold, right? Like, it's just so valuable, and that's what simplifies. Because when I uncover a new generalized principle about the universe, it's going to delete a lot of what's not, right? It's going to take away. So if I was to build an education system, which is the goal of my life, and I really want to do it, I would start there with the generalized universal principles, and then from there I would go into the specifics. And that is the opposite of the way that the current system is built. It's all about becoming a leaf on a tree, whereas I want to know, where do the roots go?
Yeah. And we touched on it a little bit briefly before, like your philosophy of like travel, of like what's the role of travel in your personal journey and your personal transformation, how that's played a big part?
Often the idea of, oh, I can't travel because it's expensive. But for me, the weird thing is, I make more money when I travel. So it's actually a cost not to. So like, it flips it on its head, you know, and obviously it takes a bit of experience. You can't just do it from a zero base and go, oh, okay, I'm moving over here and everything's gonna explode. It might. But yeah, I think it takes you out of your typical patterns and typical comforts. And yeah, for me, I just tend to be more inspired. I tend to think in a different way. I think more globally. It's a consciousness expander, for sure. It's also humbling, because like we were saying before, like, it's hard to order a coffee. Like, it's hard to, you gotta really think, and you're like, oh wow, I'm a child. Like, for all I think I might be empowered, whatever, smart and healthy and blah, blah. But if it's hard to order a coffee, you're daily reminded of how stupid you are. And you're like, oh yeah, I'm actually really dumb. So I think that's very useful for people as well.
And what do you think is the good life? Did you think that's the good life? Is like mastering all 7 areas, going on the journey to master all 7 areas of life?
For me, yeah. Yeah, for me, yeah. And I try and delete the idea of end points, because if you believe, so I had this in business, right? Or when I get to $1 million business, all my problems are going to be taken care of, and I'm going to like just sit there and, you know, rainbows are going to shine and everything's going to be, But the reality is, yeah, like you hit it and you go, oh wow, that's so cool. And then some new challenge comes in from the outside. Someone sues you for like this ungodly amount of money, and you're like, oh, what the fuck? Like, where'd that come from? And it's just you're attracting the new challenge, you know? So I think it's less about a state that you can define, and it's an external state that you can define, and it's more about an internal operating system that you can run your life by. So I think you don't need to actually, like, to master your life. It's not somewhere that you need to be, or you need to know where you need to go. It's just thinking. Like, it's just it's a state, and you can have it at any time. You know, I think when you mentioned before, when you were riding around, you just realized that there was nothing missing and everything was perfect. That to me is life mastery.